This Artificial Intelligence and Equality podcast is hosted by Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Anja Kaspersen. Together with Wendell Wallach and an international advisory board, they direct the Carnegie Artificial Intelligence and Equality Initiative, AIEI, which seeks to understand the innumerable ways in which AI impacts equality and international affairs. This episode features California Institute of Technology professor Anima Anandkumar. It was recorded on January 18th, 2022.
Anima, a huge welcome to you and thank you for taking the time to be with us today and share your insights. Your work to date has been very impressive and your personal journey an interesting one. For those of our listeners who are not familiar with who you are and your work, allow me to first do a very quick introduction. Anima holds dual positions in academia and industry, and she is a Brent Professor at California Institute of Technology, where she's also co-leading the AI for Science initiative. Additionally, she is a Director of Machine Learning Research at NVIDIA, a multinational technology company producing graphics processing units, leading efforts to develop next-generation AI algorithms. I can't wait to learn more about your pioneering work, as I'm sure all of our listeners are too. One thing I really appreciate with you when we met some months back at a joint event at CERN was just how eloquently you are able to bring rather abstract concepts and discussions on AI research and AI more broadly, talking about its applications, which are often not accessible to people outside of the research community, down to very practical considerations. And I think this speaks volumes about your dedication to the field and also your willingness and eagerness to make sure that people are empowered to engage in this discussion with the knowledge required. I thought it might be interesting to ask you to cast your mind back to growing up in India and later moving to the US. How did it all start? I've heard you speak about the importance of curiosity and how your family played a very key part in encouraging you to be inquisitive about nature, about being human, mathematics, and even the quantum bits of our existence.
Yeah, thank you, Anu. This is such a pleasure, and it's so great to reconnect again after our epic meeting at CERN, which, to me is like a pilgrimage we take to celebrate the advances in the sciences. To me, like growing up back in India, I was really lucky to have a family that valued science and technology. Both my parents are engineers. My grandfather was a math teacher. So all this made it very natural for me to explore math and sciences as a child. And especially, I think, some of the struggles my mother had to go through to get into engineering, has always inspired me. She, had to, in fact, go on a hunger strike for 3 days to make the point that she really wanted to do engineering, because back then there was a lot of notion that if women got too educated, maybe it's hard to find someone suitable to marry them and so on. And so there were concerns in the traditional community that she grew up with, in. And I think, to hear her talk of her journey and, her story of what got her so passionate about engineering, I think, a lot of that somewhat came naturally, into my childhood experiences. So I would say that shaped a lot, and I was lucky to have that. And it's also like kind of having my family just encourage my curiosity and inquisitiveness. I think I loved climbing as a kid, so they had made these contraptions where I could climb around, and we also had this mango tree in the backyard where I would be climbing all the time, spending time there. And so I think having that kind of place to explore nature and explore sciences, I think made it like a fun and a pleasurable thing, rather than as only about homeworks or only like a chore that, that is not fun. So I think that attitude was, to me, probably an important aspect.
And your journey into AI, that came later.
Yeah, I would say that, growing up, I generally was interested in maths and sciences, but I was also curious about my own mind, right? Like how, am I just able to grasp it? Because many times I would be able to be like, I see this, mathematical concept, but I wouldn't be able to fully explain how I got there, right? Like I would arrive at the answer, but it would take me much longer to explain how I arrived there. And indeed, sometimes I was wrong, but many times I was also correct. So I'm like, how did I get these intuitions? So I think these kind of aspects, I was always curious about my own mind, how that worked. And I clearly remember this childhood incident. I was maybe 3 or 4, somewhere around that age, where I was playing, and all of a sudden I have this realization that come to me that it's like, my identity like almost forming, right? Until that moment, I hadn't questioned what is me. Like suddenly it's like, oh, there is this concept called me, and somehow I had this notion, and also like I remember like telling myself, remember this moment, don't forget this, because this seems to be a powerful moment where I'm suddenly wondering like, what do I like, who am I? Right? So and that's just etched in my memory. And to me, now that I study AI and think about agents that maybe one day will become conscious, although the definition of what consciousness is up to debate, right? What would that be like to suddenly be like having that awareness of self and the relationship of self to the environment?
Very interesting. We're going to revisit the issue of consciousness very soon. First, I just wanted to ask you, because you've been straddling for some time now, both industry and academic research, and also interest embedded in both fields daily, but also many different fields of AI. Can you tell us more about this working at the interface between industry and academia? And I think you have said a few times yourself that one of your core purposes in managing these two roles is also trying to bridge these two domains in a better way than is currently happening.
Yeah, certainly, Anja. I think that's what's been like the most fun about being in AI is, right, the boundaries and the barriers just no longer matter, right? You cannot be successful in achieving great AI by putting it into silos. And, back in my like maybe high school days, I was always like, it was hard for me to pick which specific area of science or math because I loved all of it. But now in a way, you do need right, concepts from all different areas. Neuroscience is so important, like understanding our own brain, and also mammalian brains or even insect brains, right? Like how that is functioning, and what are like the key mechanisms or high level abstractions, and how do we build those capabilities into AI? That's of strong interest to me. But the other aspect is also computation. With the scale that we are looking at today, right? This can no longer be in the theoretical realm. Unfortunately, this does require very heavy computation, right? And so much of this behavior only emerges at scale. So, we wouldn't be able to do a small test bed in some cases and say, oh, this, we already understand the behavior and this is how we would expect as it scales. And so that's where there is a strong need for very efficient hardware for AI. And that's where being at NVIDIA has enabled me to explore that side, also contribute to designing better hardware, but use that for all kinds of beneficial applications that incorporate AI. And so these aspects have to come together in academia. At Caltech, there are such strong foundations in the sciences. That's where I founded the AI for Science initiative to build AI into all these different scientific domains, right? So we have to work closely with the domain experts, understand how to integrate AI into also existing workflows, right? Or maybe disrupt and build new ones, but we have to understand the domain quite well to do that and closely work with domain experts. And then on the industry side, having NVIDIA as a partner and having large scale computation as a means to achieve these goals is really important too. So it's really, right, these are all pieces of the puzzle. We need to bring that together to make it successful for AI to have a strong impact.
Often the debate on AI focuses a lot on the software component, but you also speak about the hardware component of AI.
Yeah, and in fact, like when you say software, right, there is like different levels of the stack. Like, you could write your program in Python, or if you really worry about like kind of getting very efficient hardware implementation, you may go even to a lower level, right? So there's different levels of abstractions that is incorporated into our programming frameworks, and then ultimately it has to run on some hardware. The question is how to make this very efficient to run so that we are energy efficient. We are able to also meet the sustainability goals as we deploy these AI frameworks. But at the same time, we need it to be easy to program, or in fact, there's all these notions of code-free environments, right? So where people without a programming background could easily specify what kinds of AI capabilities would they like, how can they easily bring in the data of interest and specify the tasks that they would like AI to do. So there's like these ends of the spectrum, right? So there is low-level languages, like there's the CUDA framework to, specify efficient computations on GPUs. On the other end, we have like code-free frameworks where you could even visually or through easier means of interface specify what you would like AI to do. And then the question is how to build that, how to build layers of like abstractions to connect these extreme ends, right? The ideal case is we have both a very efficient implementation as well as an intuitive, natural to use interface that ideally would not even require programming, and people in different domains across the world can easily use AI in their workflows.
I've heard you speak about your research career, Anima, and how some of your groundbreaking research builds on a very practical question: how to aggregate intelligence, supervised and unsupervised. I was hoping you could contextualize this statement and maybe add a little bit of AI history to it as well for our listeners.
Yeah, certainly, Anja. I think to me, intelligence is the ability to learn from experiences and adapt, right? So both these aspects are important. Like you need to be able to not just experience the world, but learn from it, right? And then based on that, can you like adapt and change behavior? And we see that with almost every living thing, right? In fact, we are seeing that with the coronavirus too. So there is intelligence there. But if you see like, some of like popular cases, like say some of the Boston Dynamics robots, they do impressive moves. So to many people that seems intelligent because it's able to do backflips, it's able to do all these impressive moves. But to me, that's not intelligence because it's all completely coded by hand beforehand by some very smart people, but it's not adapting, right? It's like kind of pre-planned and it's doing that maneuver. And so that's, I think, one thing for the public to, keep in mind on what is intelligent versus what is not, right? In fact, also if you look at the Deep Blue, the chess playing program that was constructed many years ago, that does not involve intelligence because it's like brute force searching through everything and coming up with a move, right? So, whereas we humans don't do it that way. We don't look at all possible chess moves. We have like some intuitions and we've kind of going by, making those. So I think that's something for the public to keep in mind. There may be lots of very impressive outcomes in some cases, but that doesn't mean it's intelligent. And vice versa, there could be some very mundane things, right, that require a huge amount of intelligence. In fact, like, at NVIDIA, the robotics group at Seattle has the kitchen environment and robots to be able to ultimately autonomously, right, cook something or do other kitchen tasks. And for many of us, it's like, oh, this is so trivial, right? We do it without thinking. But just the aspects of being able to grasp different kind of instruments and understand what to grasp at which point, and how to relate that to high level goal. Like, if I want to make an omelet, right, what is like the subtasks and how do I break it down? And so those are still extremely hard for our AI agents to understand those, right? How to break down tasks, right? That's the notion of compositionality, and how to easily generalize to new tasks. If you've like been fairly cooking many different dishes, right, and you suddenly come across a new one, or you want to get introduced to a new cuisine, sure, there's some learning, but you would learn faster than somebody who doesn't have that ability or background. But that aspect is still not completely true, right? I mean, we are exploring these, and they've been getting better with AI. So I wanted to give that high level overview of what it means for intelligence, and how do we assess intelligence. We shouldn't just go by our intuitions, because our kind of bias is towards what we find, say, in a fellow human being as impressive, right? So like, normal people are not that great at chess. So if a fellow human being is amazing, then we, give them a superhuman ability. But on the other hand, it can be very easy. I mean, easy in the sense, if we program it well, we give it enough memory for a computer to do well, right? So it's not a level playing field. So that's why we need to, carefully assess, is this impressive as an ability of intelligence, or is this impressive because of the computation, memory, and other capabilities that computers have?
And it brings me to this term that I've heard you use quite a bit, and you've been giving talks about this as well, the Trinity of AI. Can you explain that to our listeners, what it means and why it is important?
Yes, because, I mentioned like intelligence is the ability to learn from experiences and adapt, right? So the learning aspect, the most important thing is data. So how do we have enough data and maybe domain knowledge or other kind of prior information to first start learning? And then to do this learning, we of course need computation, like I mentioned, right? In some cases, maybe large scale computation. And of course, then we need, what are the algorithms to enable this learning? So the Trinity is data, computation, and algorithms. And so we need to think of all these three facets. And depending on the background from which people are coming up with, maybe they may think a lot about algorithms. If you're an AI researcher, right, the goal is to come up with new algorithms. But in so many practical applications, the bottleneck could be data. We see that in so many domains, like healthcare, there isn't enough data, or there are lots of constraints to getting the data that we need. Or in cases like sciences, right, there may not be a ground truth. If we talk about imaging the black hole, we don't have a ground truth of what the black hole looks like, right? To give as an example, or like understanding earthquakes and their seismic activity deep underground. We don't have the measurements, so we can only kind of come up with that indirectly. We don't have those direct observations. So data tends to be a big constraint in so many practical and real world applications. And the computation, people mostly don't think about it. Okay, I have a cluster, I'm going to run this. But it matters. It matters in both extremes. In one extreme where, even the enormous clusters are not good enough, right? If you're thinking about, like, say, the understanding like a kitchen environment and all possible tasks, and being able to, do these maneuvers, but also generalize to new ones, you may want a big model to learn these skills, and that requires large-scale computation. On the other end of the spectrum is tiny ML or edge AI or IoT, like all these different words we call for, right? Like small devices with only limited capabilities, limited memory, limited battery. And in those cases, we can't afford to have a large model. So then we have to be very mindful of what is the computational budget we have and how do we design the right algorithms. So we can't think of them in isolation. So now in so many applications, we have to jointly design, jointly take into considerations all the three facets, the data and the computation, and design the AI algorithms based on these constraints and availability.
So I know you spearheaded development of tensor algorithms, which I understand, if I understand correctly, are central to effectively processing multidimensional and multimodal data and for achieving massive parallelism in large-scale AI applications. Now, this may seem awfully technical, especially to a layperson like myself, and I'm sure some of our listeners as well. And I was wondering if you could sort of explain a little more in detail what these are and the importance that they hold both for the future applications of AI.
Yeah, so I'll try to, I think I'll allude to a book from, I think, the 18th century called The Flatland to kind of give a notion of why more dimensions matters, right? So this story is about of course, a fictional, a two-dimensional world where, people are represented as different geometric shapes, like they could be polygons, right? They could be circles. So that's how people are represented. And it's also, I think, a dialogue on the class system in the Victorian age. So that's how, that was one of the notions with which the book was written. But the aspect that I wanted to highlight here was, in this two-dimensional world, there is now a three-dimensional alien that visits, right? And if it's going through this two-dimensional world, it's like shape-shifting rapidly. And then it's scary for everyone in this two-dimensional world on what's going on. And I think that's why for a lot of us, thinking of more dimensions is like weird and like, okay, it's not intuitive, right? Because we try hard to visualize everything, but we can't. But the data lives in a lot of dimensions, right? So we are not just limited to what we can visualize. And it's again the same notion that if you're only in two-dimensional world, right, this three-dimensional object could be a nice geometric shape, but you cannot fully understand because it's rapidly changing and there's only limited information at each point of time as it's changing. So it's again the aspect of the elephant and the blind man. If the blind men are only touching one part of the elephant, they can't see the whole picture. And so that to me is the notion that if you can, visualize, or, instead of visualizing in your mind, if you can lift into many dimensions to represent your data and process the data, it can be much more effective because the true nature of the underlying phenomena emerges because it lives in more dimensions than what we can visualize. So hopefully that was not too abstract, but I think philosophically it makes sense too, right? There is so much that lies beyond what we can see through our own eyes. But to me, I think mathematically what's interesting about this is this naturally extends our current operation of neural networks. In neural networks, each layer is represented with a matrix, which consists of rows and columns. So you can think of that as a two-dimensional object. But the reason why this happened is historical. We have lots of linear algebra, right? Matrix multiplication is the most commonly implemented routine, and it can be highly parallelized. So we have that more as a historical reason that we design all our neural networks based on this matrix foundation. But we can easily extend to more. We can make these layers do multidimensional operation. So a tensor is now, think of a third order as a cube, right? It has not just rows and columns, but a third dimension. And so we could think of like multiplying across all these dimensions instead of just multiplying two matrices as two-dimensional objects. So to me, what this opens up is a lot richer set of primitive functions or what each layer can do. And when we can give them much richer processing, the idea is they are more capable of understanding the underlying data sets better and seeing what phenomena emerge. So that's where we've seen like kind of better capabilities using multidimensional processing in our neural networks.
So understanding the nuances and the context and the symbolics.
Yes, so essentially like kind of giving more flexibility for neural networks to learn multidimensional data sets. To give you, I think, a more intuitive example, right? So before deep learning got very popular, I was working on probabilistic models where, the goal is to like, can we extract topics from documents? So you have like, say, millions of documents, you don't have any labels. Can you tell me what are the topics in each document? And in this case, the challenge is that each document can have multiple topics instead of just one. So you can't just cluster it out and say each document is exclusively about one topic. So in these cases, what we gave was an intuitive algorithm using tensors that looks at co-occurrence relationships in data. So to give you an example, if a document had the word apple a lot, right? So if that's all I told you about the document, you could be like, okay, it's probably about fruit, but Apple is also a company, right? So a word can be used in many contexts. So just saying a few words or a particular word occurs is not enough. But if I told you that there is co-occurrence happening, the word apple and orange occur together, you are more certain that it's a fruit. And if I further told you like it's apple, orange, banana, pomelo, right? So then you're even more certain. So these co-occurrence of multiple words occurring together, right, is giving you more information about what the document is talking about. And that can be represented as a tensor. Because now you're saying, for pairwise relationship, you're saying, count all the documents where different pairs of words occur together. And now if I want to count all triplets and say how many times they occur in different documents, the object that represents it is a tensor. And so the way I process it is by using tensor algebraic methods. But of course, we don't want to write out that big tensor. If I say all triplets, that's too large in memory. And so what I designed was efficient algorithms that mathematically process these co-occurrence relationships, but without being memory intensive. So making that efficient and giving also theoretical guarantees as well as practical use cases where this is very effective.
So allowing you to infer certain causality and not just correlating the data you have.
So I would say this is still, we have further works where we can also talk about causality using these methods. But the first work where I talked about co-occurrences is still correlation-based, but it is unsupervised learning, right? It's saying, I don't know absolutely anything what the topics are because there are no labels, but I'm trying to posit that like these topics are related to co-occurrence of words, right? So by that hypothesis, I'm like uncovering the topics.
That's a very good and detailed description of your work on tensor algorithms. And I'm curious, what is it in this kind of multidimensional world that you're operating? What are you working on these days, and what excites you particularly about your research right now, be that in academia or in industry?
Yeah, it's like asking who's your favorite child, right? So
everything and everyone.
Yeah, but I think to me, that's what I'm so thankful right now at this stage of my career, my ability to work with groups of scientists, engineers from many different backgrounds and many different interests. So at Caltech, having the AI for Science initiative has allowed me to work in this area of designing machine learning methods for learning scientific simulations or any complex scientific phenomena like, say, turbulent fluid flows or climate and weather models, or how materials like tear. All these are right now requiring large-scale supercomputers, right? So if I want to tell you what the weather is going to be in the next few days. That is a very large-scale numerical calculation. But the question is, can machine learning now augment or even replace these methods and get orders of magnitude speed-ups? And in so many scenarios, this is the only way we can make progress or new discoveries or come up with better predictions. As an example, climate change is something that all of us are highly concerned about. There is so much of like the now or never, right? Which is very important to guide our politicians and others to make better policies. And so the question is, how can we come up with models of climate for the next decades, but also have the right uncertainties? If I can lower the uncertainties and give the right uncertainties, that'll really help us inform policy making. And the other important thing is also the resolution, right? If I say like globally, it's going to be 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, right? It doesn't help like in terms of what happens in the Middle East or what happens in India, where I grew up, Southern India. So, you really want as much as possible fine scale models that can tell what's going to happen as we go through multiple decades. And I think a back of the envelope calculation shows with the current models, if I try to get that down to 1 kilometer resolution and run it for the next 10 years, being able to do that requires 10 to the 11 more compute than what we have today, right? So even all our powerful supercomputers put together is not enough for what we are asking. And similarly, in terms of understanding molecules to invent new drugs, discover new drugs, to do that, just if I want to go all the way to the quantum level, like understand its properties very precisely. We know the Schrodinger's equation is the fundamental equation that counts all molecules, right? But the challenge is if I have to do that in a brute force way, right, precisely without using any approximation methods, that would take longer than the age of the universe on the current supercomputers for just 100 atom molecule. So that's, I think, the challenge in so many of these domains. We have like physical laws, we have, right, some understanding of the domain, but the computations required are so enormous that we can't do it exactly. We can't do it brute force. So the question is, can machine learning learn good approximations, or can they learn it for one domain of molecules rather than all of chemistry, right? So, in terms of the climate and weather models, can we incorporate like physical constraints, like say, the conservation of mass and so on, but be able to also use the historical data where there wasn't the climate change, but how do we then adapt it to the case now where there's going to be more, the higher emissions than the historical data, right? So there's all these challenges, right, in terms of computation, in terms of generalizing into new scenarios, extrapolating beyond what we have seen. And those are very fascinating. And what we've seen is machine learning give us very promising results. And here I should say that this is not standard machine learning in the sense, right, like, take a standard package and run it, but, better designed algorithms that take into account these domain knowledge and constraints give us a lot of promise in being able to speed up from 1,000 times, even up to hundreds of thousands of times speed up over the traditional numerical methods, or have the ability to generalize from being trained on small molecules directly to large molecules, right? So these kinds of capabilities, machine learning has shown promise when we work closely with domain experts and build it in the right way. And that's where I feel there is so much potential. We barely gotten started there.
Which goes back to your point about the Trinity, right? And how important it is to get the Trinity right if to advance on that research. Which brings me to, and this is one of the points that you made at the introduction of this podcast around consciousness. And I'm wondering, in your view, can consciousness emerge out of the Trinity? Or do you view some limitations on the extent to which the Trinity of AI can give birth to AI?
Yeah, and that's a really tough question. I mean, that's of course, everyone thinks about, what's going to happen as we start, right, scaling up these models. And the question is, are current algorithms enough, or do we need some new paradigms? Our current hardware, to me at least, is not enough, right? We need lot more computations, not just for emergence of consciousness, but also all these scientific domains that I talked about, right? So that's becoming more and more of a bottleneck as we are finishing the low-hanging fruits, so to say, in the use of machine learning. So the harder problems remain. So in my mind, there are lots of definitions of consciousness, but one that mathematically is like well posed is awareness, right? So awareness of or the uncertainties, like limitations, knowing what you don't know. And so if you're thinking of that kind of a more concrete definition rather than a self-actualization, which is really hard, I think that is nearer term, right? So we want AI agents that understand, whether is this safe or not, right? So like in safety critical applications, how safe is this to, like, say, explore? For instance, we've looked at drones, like can they automatically decide whether it's safe enough to land? Can they keep increasing the speed, but make sure they're safe enough, right? So these kind of emergence of awareness of the uncertainty of the environment around, we are seeing many cases where that is emerging. I think the harder one is the awareness of the own limitations, like knowing what you don't know. And standard neural networks are not good at it, standard supervised learning, because what they are encouraged to do is to become overconfident. Like it's part of like the learning objective that they become overconfident. And we've seen that with a lot of examples, especially right related to also fairness issues, that though the data that's underrepresented, if we see that at test time, there could also be wrong mistakes made with high overconfidence. So you see this really terrible examples of, say, Black female celebrities being misgendered, but with high confidence, right? Or face recognition going wrong, like members of Congress being classified as criminals, but with high confidence. So all these are examples where there isn't the awareness of the own limitations. This trained model hasn't seen enough training data of a certain nature, but doesn't have that understanding, right? At test time, it still makes these mistakes, but with high confidence. And so we've developed methods to try to limit those and have also good uncertainty. So if it's encountering entirely new situations, then it's also much more uncertain, right? So because, having it be correct on new scenarios is almost, impossible, right? You have to give it some other domain knowledge or other, ways that it can be correct. But an easier thing is to ask, can you at least like be humble and say, I don't know, or I have like lower confidence here. And so we are seeing that emerge. So to me, I think that foundation of consciousness is the awareness of self and awareness of surrounding. And to begin with, the uncertainty or the limitations of what the trained agent can do, and also understanding the risks in the environment is the beginning, right? It's the underpinnings of consciousness. And so that we are beginning to see, but in fairly limited environments, in fairly, right, synthetic environments or limited real world scenarios.
And you alluded to this, Anima, but I'm wondering, do you think, it's said that it takes a lifetime to learn how to operate in these liminal spaces as a human. Do we have the right scientific models to code and train an algorithm to operate in liminal spaces?
It depends, right? So I think that's where, right, it's hard to judge what is difficult for AI versus humans. Like if the limitation is one of like memory or computation, there is a lot of gains we can make, and we've seen that to happen. Even in computer vision, if you look at the history, right? So there were all these hand-engineered features people thought, right? If you did like these kind of scale invariant features, that would be good, or Fourier features, that would be good. So people had different intuitions of what would be good to recognize objects in images. But letting neural networks on their own figure out and learn features was very powerful. We've also seen that in some of the scientific applications we are currently working on, right? So humans have made all kinds of approximations, say for this quantum chemistry, I mentioned the basic Schrodinger's equation being so enormously intensive to compute that people have made different approximations. But there's a lot of now evidence emerging that machine learnings could come up with better approximations. So, but you have to build in the right domain knowledge and constraints, right? So you have to kind of specify it the correct way. So I do think that, in that sense, AI is promising, but it's always the devil is in the details on how we harness that power of AI.
I heard you quote the late Richard Feynman, the English mathematician, who posited, "What I do not create, I do not understand." And to draw a parallel to sort of current realities, the COVID-19 pandemic has arguably accelerated how we adopt and embed AI systems and algorithmic technologies. And technologies where the gap between those who create and the understanding is widening, causing very significant trade-offs, in my view, and also gray areas of ethics. And I know this is an area that you're deeply concerned with, this issue around ethics in AI. And you've been a very strong advocate for addressing these implicit tensions tied with the choices we make about how we embed AI in our day-to-day lives, and also call for better and more innovative ways of mitigating any potential harms. Do you worry? I mean, what are your serious concerns about AI?
Yeah, I think, to me, it's very important, as with any technology, right? We have to have the right safeguards. I know it's a cop-out by saying, yes, this applies to all technologies, but I think it's even more important with AI because of this exponential power, in the sense of like, what, say, humans were doing probably at the small scale in terms of the biased decisions they were making. We are automating that at like planet scale, right? And we are doing that very quickly. And so much of the changes we are bringing about is potentially irreversible. And so I think that is the aspect that we need to be mindful of. And so what happened in terms of like historically, right, with technology, right, there is the hype, there is like kind of all the promise of new technology, then people also see the downsides, and there are many scientists extremely worried of the destructive nature. So I see a similar trend also happening with AI. But now I think the difference is, right, this touches human lives across the world in very intimate ways because of like the data collection, right, that we are seeing at enormous scale, and the ways we are potentially changing behavior, influencing, at such a large scale, at such a fast speed. And I think that's where it's very important to think about having trustworthy AI and having safeguards and regulations in place in terms of, right, all aspects. How does this AI perform under different skin tones or different genders, or people who identify as non-binary, right? So it's all these aspects, right? There could be, say, 99% of the population, it's okay, but the 1%, it's terrible. Do we want such an AI, right? But to me, right, answering such questions is hard, right? We need to make trade-offs. But the first step is transparency, right? Unless we've tested this out on enough like data sets and release that before launching it at scale, then we can make the decisions. But right now, that's not how we are proceeding, So that's, I think, a place for regulation and for, I think, nonprofits and agencies that, think about the impact of technology on the public to have a say.
And two questions that comes out of that, because you mentioned once it is embedded, it begs the question, can it be discontinued? can you safely interrupt an AI agent once it is embedded into a system? And will this agent also be able to interoperate with other systems that may have been created and trained in a different type of environment? What are your views on it?
I think a lot of awareness has been raised, and a lot of people have worked very hard to do that, and sometimes even going against big tech. But I think now there is awareness, I think, across all different areas that we need to put a mechanism in place for transparency. Can we enable good disclosure? What should that disclosure be? I mean, we already kind of have licenses for code. We have the use cases, like how they should be used, what the ethical uses, in which this code can be deployed. But can we go further and say, in terms of what types of data would this work well, or where it doesn't work? I think this is the aspect that's always hard. I think we were talking about it before the podcast, that the incentive is to hype up and to say this is always great, but no technology can be perfect. And so I think disclosing the failure modes is the most important starting point.
So I wanted to just touch on this issue of AI and power, and you alluded to it earlier. And I remember in a previous talk you gave, you spoke about the transformative power of AI to, as you alluded to with AI for science, to amplify other sciences, to help other sciences advance in quite unique ways. But there's also the story of AI as shifting power. Who holds the power? Who defines the rules of the game, if you may, on how AI is being advanced? And there's also this misnomer, which I know has been a concern of yours as well, where you speak about AI systems as apolitical, which obviously are not. Once they're embedded into a system, you give it direction. And this, brings us back to, your issue around Trinity, and how does that Trinity look? And each part of that Trinity will have its own unique power dynamics and power mechanisms attached to it. In your view, keeping that in mind, how do we design AI ethically, addressing those inevitable trade-offs to ensure that it benefits humanity at large?
Yeah, and I think this is where there are several stakeholders, to enable that we can harness the beneficial uses of AI and minimize its harmful effects. And to begin with, I think what we need is more research resources for academia. For instance, in the US here, we have the government pushing for NAIR, which is the National AI Research Resource. So can we have enough computation to enable these large-scale models to be done openly or in academia, Because so much of it is locked up with big companies that researchers cannot carefully understand the potential harmful effects, or what is the bias that is there, or how do we mitigate it? How do we use this in downstream tasks, knowing that these issues exist, and can we still separate them, or sandbox them to make use of it in a beneficial way. And I think that's where that's one big bottleneck, and there is a big gap between industry and academia with respect to resources. So helping bridge that is important. The other important thing is the role of regulatory agencies, when it comes to healthcare versus, say, transportation versus different areas, there cannot be one size fits all in terms of even what to disclose, or how should we test these AI systems. And so it has to be domain specific, and for safety critical domains like healthcare or transportation, there has to be even more stringent requirements of how good the AI is. And I think, the aspect of how we can build it in a way that's equitable and fair, and how we can put this in place, and how we can have companies disclose this to the public. I think that's a good starting point.
And I like what you said about, if I heard it correctly, that collaboration can be a very important tool to actually implement some of those checks and balances, responsible science, which is taking a page out of the playbook from CERN, right? You know, bringing together researchers from different domains, different countries, and instilling a sort of checks and balances, responsible science approach.
Absolutely. I mean, this requires an interdisciplinary approach. And this is where, you know, the people from humanities and social sciences have a lot to add. You know, for instance, I work with Mike Alvarez here at Caltech, understanding conversations that happen in Twitter. You know, how did the Me Too movement unfold? What were the counter movements? You know, we use machine learning tools to extract the insights, but then how to interpret that and how does it inform about the social discourse that comes with collaborating with domain experts. And similarly, when it comes to AI trust and ethics, right, what are the legal frameworks, right? What are the ethical frameworks? How do I map all the stakeholders? And how do we understand historical biases? So all this, I think, is needed, right? It cannot be done in isolation.
In 2018, Anima, you won the New York Times Good Tech Award for your long-term efforts to promote diversity in the tech field at large, with a specific focus on making the AI research community more inclusive. Can you speak more about this? And also, I'm wondering, given your courage on speaking truth to power about be it limitations or the importance of maintaining or investing in the Trinity of AI and also about diversity and inclusion, have you experienced pushback for some of your work and speaking up?
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I think, you know, what's important to keep in mind is diversity and inclusion is about, seeing people from different backgrounds and areas come together, right, and giving everyone a platform to speak and to contribute. And what we see is in so many of AI areas, there is a huge underrepresentation of many communities of women, and that hopefully, will change with these efforts. But we also want to make sure that, you know, this is not a zero-sum game in the sense of this is not something against the majority, right? So that's a misconception that I think a lot of people hold, that what we want is to give opportunities to people across different areas, but to do so in an inclusive and a healthy way, so that, you know, creating healthy environments will enable everyone to thrive, including the majority. And so this, I think the core issue here is, you know, what are some ways that are limiting minorities from pursuing AI, right? And what is responsible for the leaky pipeline of women, dropping out at different levels of their career. But these kind of underlying toxic issues also affect others. So it's really about having a healthy environment that enables people to thrive, and people with different capabilities or different backgrounds, how they can contribute in creative ways to building AI. Because I think that's the aspect. AI cannot be solved with just one set of tools or one-dimensional thinking. And so bringing that community together is so important to see AI being successful. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the pushback that I received, especially online, speaks more to, I think, the structure of social media in terms of amplifying the marginal views, right, the extremist views, rather than the moderate views. Like, you know, the majority of people, when I talk to them in person, are highly supportive. And when they're aware of what were some of the issues that we faced in, say, conferences in terms of harassment or other issues, right? Most people want that to change. But I think the nature of social media does not encourage such good discourse, and that creates trolling and all these issues. And also like misinformation, right? People kind of misunderstanding what this is about and feeling insecure and thinking it's something against them, gets, I think, people into this mindset. So what I see this as a broader issue of how social discourse through social media gets distorted. And I think we have to find other venues to do that. And so a lot of the efforts of diversity and inclusion, what I've found to be most effective is talking to people, right, in person or virtually, but people to people, and thinking of concrete scenarios to improve that, such as the wonderful organizations like AI for All, doing that at the high school level, or the WAVE program at Caltech, bringing members from underrepresented community for summer research. So I think, to me, right, like focusing on concrete efforts rather than social media, I think will give us a lot of concrete gains.
And do you feel that the very polarized sort of social media or online discussions on this is preempting an honest scientific discourse on these issues because people are afraid to speak up?
Yes, that's right. And it also gets, misconstrued, right, on both sides. So, and I think that leaves a lot of people afraid because they may worry that anything they may say, may make them targets. And so I think we need a better avenue to discuss that. I've, for instance, I participate in admissions of students and faculty at Caltech, right? And then the notion that we would be having a different bar based on which background people come from is definitely misinformed. Instead, what we want to do is evaluate people as a whole, and we want to, hopefully, we want to, find people that positively impact the community. And so, one of the recent discussions that happened on Twitter over the last month was somebody alleging that, I won't repeat that because it is inflammatory, about how so many people in academia are there, but they shouldn't be there because they're not qualified and they came through these programs, which is highly misinformed. And I think those kinds of extreme personalities, talking about it, just, it's more about building a mob rather than about healthy discussions. But I think we need much more safe environments for people, if they have questions, because a lot of others may be having questions. Is this really happening, right? How do we address that in an environment that makes it, like for those who are in good faith wanting to have these arguments, how do we do that? But there's always a fraction of the community that is so polarized and so extreme, and doing that in a bad faith that we don't want to engage with. So we have to, I think, have that differentiation, and then that can lead to productive discussions.
We need greater anthropological and scientific intelligence, not just in the development and use of AI, but also how we discuss it, and just encourage diversity of use.
Yeah, and so much of social media, the design of it is so one-dimensional, and that clearly shows the lack of diversity in the people who designed it, because they
we need more tensors.
Yeah. Yes, tensors of people. I'll use that. That's great.
Indeed, tensors of people to discuss AI in a way it deserves to be discussed and ought to be discussed. Let's shift to a different topic, Amina, and one that I know is near and dear to your heart. You state in your bio that you grew up in Mysore, and for any yoga practitioners or those interested in yoga listening to this podcast, this will be a very familiar name, as it's known to be one of the hubs of yoga in India. I practiced there myself, many moons ago, and definitely has grown a great fondness for this place. And I know you yourself is a very dedicated yoga practitioner and also active in many types of sports, in climbing and hiking. And I know this is something that is important to you, not just yoga for the physical discipline, the asanas, but also yoga, more importantly, for its philosophical orientation. And one of the fascinating aspects to your work and to your interest, and I've seen this feature in some of your work and in your public speeches, is your interest in the Advaita or Vedanta philosophy. And for those of our listeners who are not aware of what this is, these are texts that are more than 2,000 years old. And I'm curious, what is it about the Advaita philosophy and its tradition that interests you? And do you see a connection to this when you talk about the ethical issues of AI, if any?
Yeah, no, those are fascinating. Yeah, I recall how we had talked about Mysore, and I have such great memories, and it's such a wonderful place, to grow up, and for me to really discover yoga during the pandemic was such a bright spot, right? When there's so much disturbing things happening around the world, all our worldviews are challenged and upended. At that place of uncertainty, I took the time to delve deeper, because I had practiced on and off, but never had enough time in our busy lives to do that. I realized how much of time I had spent on flights, how much of time I was sleep deprived, I was jet lagged, right? Kind of going from that to one where, I use yoga to just kind of calm my mind and to be in a place where I can listen to my inner self. I felt that was missing for so long. There was so much of me just functioning in the external world, but what about my own internal world, and how do I understand my emotional state and my stress levels? And so I think that aspect was so important, and how the physical and mental is so connected, right? So we talk about embodiment, how, right, kind of when I'm stressed, how my muscles are also sore. So, how I work out better when I have the motivation. So I think that also informs me about embodied AI. We need to bring the mind and the body together, like the saying, a healthy mind in a healthy body. I think that I discovered that was missing in my own life, because I was so focused on my career, and I was passionate about AI and about research, but I had forgotten the ability to take care of my own mental, spiritual, and physical health, right? All that integrated, put together. And so that kind of, I think, helped me do even better research, have better creativity, better ways to connect with everyone. And so that's what I hope others can also explore, because this is such a wonderful mechanism to experience that. Regarding the Advaita philosophy, I think that's also intimately connected with yoga and its practice, because what it says is also to look inwards. The famous saying there is aham brahmasmi. So it says I am the God, essentially, if you translate it directly. But what it's really saying is the God is within you. You want to experience the power that is within you. You don't need to go out looking for that. And so if all of us take the time for internal introspection, which a lot of the world around us prevents us from doing, right? The social media, always being on or always being connected, all this really prevents us. So disconnecting and taking that time for internal introspection and just seeing the beauty and the power we have within ourselves, I think that's wonderful. And I don't know if AI is able to do that one day, but if it can, that would also be an amazing feat.
Being at the vanguard of change requires a lot of courage. And we heard this from other speakers on this podcast as well, which is not an easy path to choose, especially as you alluded to yourself, that the pushback, warranted or unwarranted, can be quite soul destroying. What are the one or two insights that you can share with those listeners who are or will find themselves being at the vanguard of change?
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I've learned is so much about, right, the positive aspects of humanity. Yes, there were stages where I was really sad or lost some hope in humanity, but ultimately it's come around, right? I think to kind of have the patience to work through issues, because I think all, like except for maybe a tiny sliver of the population, most of them want for the common good, right? Most of us want to be part of a community. Most of us want the planet to thrive. And so I think identifying that and kind of being able to connect with people that may look like they're from different background, or that may look like they're in different sides of the political spectrum. But I think seeing what connects us, what is common to us, right? Allowing that to be celebrated, I think, will bring us closer. And that's what I've learned, that yes, there was a lot of pushback online, but it also amplifies that. I mean, a few extreme views get a lot of traction, and then you think, oh my God, is everybody thinking this way? But then you talk to actual people, then it's so different, right? And even people who misunderstood what they were supporting and they come around, then it's different. Like, for instance, the name change movement to change NIPS, which was the original name of the most important or the most popular machine learning conference, to one that doesn't talk about a body part, right? Had so much pushback. And for me, it was really shocking, because I'm like, many women are feeling uncomfortable about it. I had somehow made peace with it because I was in the community long enough, but so many young women felt that was not welcoming, and that related to also how they were treated in these events, and how these events had become so toxic and not healthy. So, but for a lot of people online, they only see that, oh, there is all this mob of women trying to change the name of conference, and this is kind of useless, this is a waste of time, right? And so, but in person, when you tell them, look, this is the experience we had at these conferences, right? It's not just name change for nothing. It's symbolizing all the struggles we have, and how this name becomes an avenue for harassment, because people use it jokingly and in a way to kind of further make an unhealthy environment. Then they get it, right? So it's much more than just the name. But it's very hard for people to get this context online. I mean, we even published a paper on it, but people don't have the attention span. They're quickly liking things. So I feel that whole interface has to change. And until that changes, we can't have healthy discourse.
How do we ensure that everybody in the community, meaning, all of us, is able to get the best benefit from current AI research and future AI research, but also to be able to contribute in a meaningful way? How do we empower people to engage, for those who may not have the insight, the literacy to fully grapple with what AI symbolizes or means to them in the day-to-day life? Where do we go from here? Like, what's your final insight on that? What do you recommend people to do?
Yeah, so I have a lot of hope in this aspect, because we've seen so much of AI research in the open, right? It has only grown to be even more open. Because if you see traditionally what has happened with technological development is highly closed. I know you think of an extreme view like nuclear weapons, right? That is really closed off. And along with it, like particle physics, or our understanding of the basic nature of atoms. A lot of the population cannot participate in it, even if they're interested. But on the other hand, with AI, so much of it is out in the open. There is excellent course material available. There's lots of code. And so then the next question is, how do we further go from there to one where can you do it in a code-free manner? Can you specify your knowledge in more intuitive ways rather than through program code? And that's still in its infancy, but I have good hope that we'll further, make progress there.
But you remain a positivist and an optimist that we're going to get it right.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there is so much good to come out of this. But that's the beauty of our mind, right? We see all these kind of concepts, suddenly they connect, and so much of scientific discovery is making those connections that seem unrelated. So, that always fascinates me.
Thank you so much, Anima, for sharing your time, stories from your upgrowing, what inspired you, your deep expertise, and honest reflections about the state of AI research. This has been a thought-provoking and a marvelous conversation. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in, and a special thanks to the team at the Carnegie Council for hosting and producing this podcast. For the latest content on ethics and international affairs, be sure to follow us on social media at Carnegie Council. My name is Anja Kaspersen, and I hope we earned the privilege of your time. Thank you.